Yes.
Welcome, everyone. Guess we can get started. Thank you all for being here and for joining us both in person and online for this critical discussion on humanitarian principles and practice, and particularly on the concept of neutrality and what it means in the ongoing genocide of Gaza. I hope you can all hear me well. Yeah. And online, if we can just get a sense if the group online can hear us well. Yep, great. Excellent. All right, so like the past 15 months have exposed deep tensions within the humanitarian sector. Across organizations, we've seen intense internal debates, particularly between staff and the leadership over narrative, language, institutional positioning, and the role of neutrality. Some organizations have explicitly called for a ceasefire and accountability, denouncing violations, while others have exercised restraints, using muted language on Palestinian rights and Israeli accountability, citing neutrality as a guiding principle. The New Humanitarian has documented a growing disconnect between the sector's predominantly global north-based leadership and its majority global south workforce who are demanding a more active stance on Gaza. These divisions raise the fundamental question: is neutrality increasingly at odds with the core mission and values of the humanitarian sector? The principle of neutrality is often framed as one of the fundamental pillars of humanitarian action, deeply embedded and practiced and referenced in IHL law, and often seen as an essential for security access to affected populations. Defenders of neutrality argue that it enhances, or at least does not jeopardize, humanitarian access. But neutrality has never been an uncontested concept. Its interpretation and application have been debated for years, particularly as conflict grows more protracted and asymmetric. What does neutrality mean in a context where injustice is clear and violations of IHL are routine? Can neutrality be maintained when a genocide is unfolding in real time, now for over 15 months, despite ICJ rulings and mounting evidence? And what does it mean when the humanitarian sector itself is collapsing under the weight of funding cuts, particularly the suspension of US aid and other major donor contributions? With donor funding shifts, operational constraints, and a crisis of public trust, the sector faces a moment of reckoning. How can humanitarian action remain both principled and responsive at the same time? These are some of the urgent questions that we will explore today. Our discussion will center on three deeply interlinked themes: neutrality, power dynamics in the aid sector, and solidarity. I'm very honored to introduce our guest speakers, each of whom has shown true leadership in shaping this discourse around humanitarian leadership. They bring diverse perspectives on how neutrality is understood and applied in practice, how institutions have responded, and what needs to change. Moshe Khalidi is the Palestinian Territory Policy Lead at Oxfam and a seasoned humanitarian policy expert specializing in protection, humanitarian access, and accountability under international law. With a career grounded in strategic advocacy and principled communication, she has been at the forefront of shaping Oxfam's policy response to the crisis in Gaza and the West Bank. We have Lynn Fuad on my right, who is a senior research officer with the Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI Global, with experience in conflict analysis and policy research. Her areas of work have covered a range of global humanitarian reform issues, including internal displacement, protection, and the role of narratives in policy agendas. And to my left, we have Erwin Loy, who is a senior policy editor at the New Humanitarian, a news agency that reports on crisis to inform prevention and response. He covers the decision-making behind humanitarian response and what it means for people living in emergencies. And last but not least, we have Meg Sefter, who is the CEO of Ground Truth Solutions, an organization that seeks to support people affected by crisis to influence humanitarian programming and decision-making. She's long been a voice on the need for more accountable and transparent. The session is going to be for an hour and a half. The speakers each will speak for around 10 minutes, and then we will open the floor for questions and answers. And without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Bushra Khalidi, who's joining us from Palestine and Ramallah. The floor is yours, Bushra.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me well? Yeah, my camera might freeze a bit. Yeah. Well, thank you for having me, first of all. Thanks for all of you for coming today. I know the room is packed, so I'm very honored and it's a pleasure to be here, especially to talk about this. We truly are at a juncture. And I'm sorry in advance if I go a little over my 10 minutes, but I know we have a little more time, so I hope that's okay. As a Palestinian humanitarian worker, having worked in this field now almost 10 years, this discussion, it's not a theoretical debate for me. It's deeply personal. I have family in Gaza. I live in the West Bank. My home was taken by settlers last year in the old city of Jerusalem. So I've watched from afar as the cities of my country and my homeland have been bombed into dust. While working every day to keep our operations running and securing access and advocate for access. So when we talk about neutrality, we need to be honest on how it's being interpreted and misused, and frankly, it's being weaponized. Neutrality was never meant to be silence. It was meant to ensure that humanitarian actors could reach people in need, no matter their politics. But what we're seeing in Gaza today, it's not politics. It's a campaign of destruction that's so relentless, that's so systematic, that even the International Court of Justice had to intervene. We're over 60,000 killed, probably much more. Most of them have been women and children. Starvation was used as a weapon of war by Israel. Israel has attacked hospitals. So it's not just a humanitarian crisis. It's a real crisis of justice and law and humanity. And when neutrality is used to demand silence from humanitarian organizations, even as international law is openly violated, then we need to ask ourselves, has this principle maybe outlived its purpose, or are we misapplying it? At Oxfam, we've always held that neutrality is a tool and not an end. So our humanitarian values, and I'm speaking on behalf of Oxfam, are anchored in justice, in dignity, and the right of all people to live free from violence and oppression. So when neutrality is understood to mean not taking sides in conflicts, it's reasonable. But when neutrality becomes moral equivalence between the occupier and the occupied, between the bomber and the besieged, we're not being neutral, we're being complicit. And this is where the conversation, I think, on decolonization comes in. Humanitarian aid still carries traces of its colonial legacy. You know, we operate in places like Sudan or the DRC, even in Palestine, with rules set by power holders far removed from the communities affected. And we ask our local partners to stay neutral, even when their own homes are bombed and their children are killed and their water is cut off. So that's not neutrality, that's erasure. And so if we're serious about shifting power, about local leadership, about localization, you know, we must let frontline responders speak their truth. And we must stop silencing their calls for justice under the pretense of neutrality. It's not just unethical, it's unsustainable. No one is going to continue to deliver under these conditions if their pain and their own humanity and their voice is not recognized. So no, neutrality is not inherently incompatible with justice, but the way it's being applied in Gaza today, and maybe in broader Palestine, that's not neutrality. That's a shield for inaction, and we have to do better. In terms of, you know, advocating for justice and accountability for Palestinians and how it comes with immense challenges. And we try to push for meaningful change in a context where mass atrocities are being committed and have continued to unfold for the last 19 months. International humanitarian law is openly violated, and accountability mechanisms have been completely obstructed, where even institutions like the highest international courts are facing sanctions and criticism and smearing for attempting to uphold justice. So given these immense political pressure, we have a role to play as humanitarian actors. What does it say about our world when the ICJ or the ICC or the United Nations are facing criticisms or sanctions just for doing their job? Like when the top UN humanitarian agency in Gaza, UNRWA, is defunded based on unverified allegations, while the evidence of mass atrocities committed against Palestinian civilians continues to grow day by day, even today. And what does it say about us, humanitarian actors, if we remain quiet in the face of this? So I just want to be very clear. We're not witnessing a momentary lapse of justice. We're witnessing a complete collapse. And our sector is at a crossroads. So either we stand up for the principles we claim to defend, human rights, IHL, accountability, or we risk becoming completely irrelevant. In Gaza, it's not just buildings that have been destroyed, it's the entire fabric of life. Water, food systems, education, healthcare, all have been systematically dismantled. This didn't happen by accident. It happened through deliberate military strategy carried out with complete impunity and has been enabled by the silence and the complicity of the international community. And yet, humanitarian organizations are discouraged from naming this reality. We're told to stay in our lane and to focus on needs and not causes. But how can we provide needs-based aid if the needs are created by policies designed to destroy life? The pressure is really real. You have no idea. We're being defunded. We're risking being deregistered. Our staff risks to be investigated, potentially arrested, detained. Donors are vetting language more than they're even vetting facts. But we need to recognize that in this environment, silence is not neutral. It's very political. And silence in the face of atrocity crimes is not safety, it's surrender. So what can we do? In my sense, and I think this is my opinion and my analysis of having worked here for the last, worked on this context for 10 years, but on this crisis for the last 18 months, is we need to reclaim our mandate. Humanitarian action is not just about delivering aid. Let me be very clear. And our Palestinian partners that are on the ground have said that time and time again to the humanitarian and in the international community. It's about protecting life and dignity. And that includes speaking out against violations that make aid delivery impossible. And also, second, we need collective courage. We need to be brave. One organization alone cannot carry the risk, but together we can create a shield of shared principles. And we've seen glimpses of this, of course, in the joint statements, in some maybe staff walkouts, in really brave and courageous internal discussions and conversations, but it's not enough. And third, we must connect with movements, with civil society, with legal advocates, with human rights defenders, because they're also part of that same ecosystem. And we're stronger when we act in solidarity. And accountability, it's not a luxury. And it's the only way we prevent the next atrocity. And so our credibility as a sector depends on whether we rise to this moment or do we let it pass. And so solidarity with Palestinians and how it's evolving in the coming period or in the future, what can we do as humanitarians to pressure and advocate for justice? And maybe what lessons can we draw from, previous global solidarity movements? Solidarity is often invoked, but it's actually rarely lived. And so we say we stand with affected communities, but are we willing to stand up for them when it costs us? That's the real test. And right now, Palestine is the real test. The global solidarity movement around Gaza is unprecedented. Or around Palestine, it's unprecedented. We're seeing people from New York to Johannesburg to Jakarta marching, writing, risking their careers, even their lives to demand justice. And yet, within our sector, we're still hesitant. We're still cautious. We're still walking on eggshells. We really have so much to learn from previous movements, like, for example, the anti-apartheid movement. That movement succeeded not just because it had moral clarity, but because it combined moral clarity with strategic pressure. Restrictive measures, divestment, sanctions, public campaigns. They didn't just target the perpetrators, but also those enabling the system, companies, the banks, the states. So humanitarian actors today, they have to grapple with the same question. What is our role in the systems of oppression? Are we simply mitigating suffering, or are we really challenging the root causes? And so for Palestinians, solidarity, it's not abstract. It means defending the right, our own right to exist. It means resisting attempts to criminalize our own identity. It means pushing for an end to the illegal occupation, not just the delivery of aid under it. So we as humanitarians, we can't do everything, but we can amplify the voices of local partners and Palestinians who are silenced. We can support legal accountability and strategic litigation efforts, even if it's quietly. We should absolutely refuse to self-center just to remain palatable to donors. And we should show up in rooms like this and like you are today. Solidarity must be more than empathy. It really must be action. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bushra. I'm going to give the floor to Eileen, who's going to be next.
Can you hear me like this?
They won't be able
Okay,
to online.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here for this very timely discussion. And thank you, Bushra, for setting the tone for this panel. So the humanitarian system has long upheld principles of neutrality, impartiality, and independence to distance itself from political influence, asserting that humanitarian aid is about alleviating suffering, protecting civilians, and not taking sides. And this apolitical humanitarianism has long been the foundation of humanitarian response. But what the ongoing crises have showed us, what Sudan, what Syria, what Yemen, and what the ongoing genocide in Gaza is showing us, is that apolitical humanitarianism undermines the sector's effectiveness and its ability to respond to those most affected. We all know that humanitarian action can be intentionally politicized. It can be used as a tool to serve political, military, or ideological interests, rather than being distributed based solely on need. And what we've seen from the recent US aid cuts, that humanitarian action is deeply intertwined with politics. And however much it wants to stay away from politics, in its current state and form, it's unable to. Governments, donors, and international institutions who fund the majority of humanitarian efforts have their own political interests, shaping how and where aid is provided, let alone if aid money is even available. So within this context, neutrality is framed as a tool to ensure access and impartial aid delivery. But in many cases, it has functioned as a mechanism that reinforced existing power structures, power imbalances, and impeded effective humanitarian assistance. The power and ability to grant access usually lies within those with the most power, and those are often the ones perpetrating violence. At the time of this panel, we witnessed this in Gaza, where those indiscriminately attacking civilians are also the actors that control humanitarian access and the humanitarian response. On March 2, 4 weeks ago, Israel imposed a total siege on Gaza, the second time in the last 18 months, blocking the entry of aid, a directive that remains in effect until today. And on March 18, Israel relaunched widespread airstrikes on Gaza, killing almost 800 people. The UN also announced a withdrawal of 30% of its staff from Gaza after 8 aid workers were killed this week only by Israeli airstrikes. So the question we must ask ourselves, does it serve the need of affected populations for humanitarian organizations to be neutral in such situations? Or has neutrality become an ideological constraint that limits the humanitarian sector's ability to respond to injustice? This is not a new debate, nor it's a new topic that we're bringing forward today. And yet we're still seeing these dynamics unfold, both in Gaza and elsewhere. Interpretations of neutrality has been done with a very rigid and solid international aid system that only knows how to work through a form of central government. We saw this in Syria, where some humanitarian organizations, under the guise of neutrality and not taking sides, only worked and operated in regime-controlled areas, collaborating with the regime, who manipulated aid delivery, provided their own list of beneficiaries, restricting aid and access to opposition-controlled areas. all the while continuing to cause mass atrocities across the country, including starvation, sieges, and aerial bombardment. We're seeing this in Gaza for the last 18 months. The application of neutrality also often disregards the actual reality on the ground of unequal power structures. It assumes that all parties to the conflict have equal standing, when in reality there is often a clear oppressor and a clear oppressed. In terms of access, neutrality is often framed as an operational or as a tool to maintain operational access. But in so many places, in so many contexts, neutrality doesn't get you access because there are strong authorities who control that access. Even the language around access has an international lens, because what it effectively means, it's access from the outside looking in, access of those being on the outside, international community, to those on the inside, the local community. People who have access, people who truly have access, are those who are already in and present, namely civil society organizations, local actors, and mutual aid groups. But neutrality often places an unfair burden on those actors, forcing them to adopt depoliticized approaches that do not reflect the realities of their communities. And Bushra mentioned this. These organizations are often pressured by international donors to maintain neutrality, even when doing so undermines their ability to advocate for justice and protection. Local civil society organizations are often the frontline humanitarian workers in many situations where access of international organizations is difficult. We've recently done research on civic space in several countries, and we've seen from this research that, for example, in Myanmar, civil society actors have long rejected neutrality, arguing that it disregards the lived experiences of communities facing state-led oppression. Neutrality in this case is not a shield against bias, but rather a failure to acknowledge injustice and systematic injustice. We saw these dynamics similarly in Sudan, for many national civil society actors being firmly rooted in their communities and adapting and pivoting according to the community's needs and interests is key to their operational access and to their accountability. So expecting neutrality in such local actors in line with humanitarian principles is unrealistic and at odds with the reason why those actors have operational access in the first place. The humanitarian sector has pledged to decolonize aid, to center affected communities and promote localization. However, the rigid application of neutrality is fundamentally at odds with these commitments. Localization requires recognizing the leadership and agency of local actors, yet neutrality often forces them into passive roles that limit their ability to advocate for their own community. The future of humanitarianism should not be one of passive neutrality, but of active solidarity. If we are serious about decolonizing aid and amplifying the voices of those affected, we must move beyond neutrality and embrace a more justice-oriented approach. Thank you. I'll hand it back to
Thank you, Dean. And I'm going to hand over now to Erwan on my next.
Thanks, everyone. So I work for the New Humanitarian. We're a media agency. One of our priorities is to decolonize our journalism. And so every now and then I get asked to speak a presentation about what that actually means. And I always get a bit nervous about that because I think it's an important path for us to be on, but no one really knows where it ends. I feel a bit awkward about saying that we're the ones to tell you we're not. But I think it's an important road. So what I usually settle on is a spiel about trust. I think there is a crisis of trust in the international community. We all know that. There's a crisis of trust in the multilateral system. You don't know that by now. It goes through the heart of the humanitarian sector. See signs of this mistrust everywhere through this building. Government donors don't trust humanitarians to spend their money effectively. I know that's a bit too soon right now. That's why you see all this earmarked funding. That's why we're in the situation that we're in. National governments don't trust the international aid system to have their best interests at heart. Often communities in crisis don't see solutions they want among the humanitarians offering the help. The international system does not trust local humanitarians. I'll say that again. The international system does not trust local humanitarians. It demands that they jump through hoops to prove their worth. It does not ask the same international system. Questions their principles at every turn. In turn, many local humanitarian leaders don't trust the international system. I think that mistrust is well founded. So about a year ago, I was on a panel, and my colleague was warning about what he called the crisis of decolonization, where trust erodes completely. And that was a year ago, but I think we were pretty much already there. And that was because of Gaza. You see the double standards became the norm. Practicing double standards became the norm. International norms were ignored. Internally in organizations, saw this real division, this really painful personal division, this disconnect between aid workers from the global south, if I can generalize, and the decision makers disproportionately from and based in the global north. I think at a time when those who believe in solidarity and multilateralism are trying to regroup and reset and rebuild, I think Gaza is not just a separate conversation. It's part of that equation. So I asked me to speak about some of the internal dynamics that we're reporting on over the last year related to Gaza. I think many people in this room know them too well, so I won't try to repeat everything, but I'll just have a few examples from what people told me. Generally speaking, biggest criticisms were around self-censorship, failure to speak plainly, failure to contextualize the crisis. It did not start on the 2nd of October. To me, we were talking about neutrality as something to debate or reconsider. To me, it felt like that was not even a demand. The consistent staff demand that was shared with me, different organizations, was by the same standards we use in Ukraine or anywhere to Gaza. They were not saying neutrality, redefine it. To me, it was a simpler argument. The defense from institutions and organizations is always humanitarian sector neutrality. So what I saw was a lot of explosive internal meetings, petitions, a lot of outrage, a lot of feelings of hurt, insult, and betrayal. I heard about a lot of fear. Staff in the region, especially if you identify as being from the Middle East. If you're in Lebanon and Israel is launching strikes and you're wondering if your organization has your back, you need to think. Others in the West, with Islamophobia taking hold, it's a question of whose suffering counts. And I think aid leaders truly understood that level of where this was coming from. Just jotted down a few words people told me: alienated, marginalized, dehumanized, tired, frustrated, hopeless. Many people left their jobs, as you know. I don't know if I need to get into too many specifics, but one of the organizations we covered was International Rescue Committee. Other organizations, where people worked for other organizations, focused on them as an example, seen as extremely cautious, even compared to their own very cautious organizations. The IRC removed at one point last year, removed articles that did not have the correct language. It's unclear internally where that language was supposed to come from, because it did not follow guidelines on approved language. There was an explainer page on Gaza that was edited in a really odd way. It seemed to soften language on Israeli actions, spotlight Hamas, dim the focus on Palestinian deaths, and embraced attribution for their killings. Just one quote I highlighted explaining the deaths. This was the page that explained deaths. Gaza, airstrikes, fighting, and commingling with civilians are having a devastating impact. There are over 37,000 fatalities of Palestinians. That's sort of what I understand what goes throughout the page. It removed mention of Israeli responsibility for denying aid. It deleted all references to Palestine or the occupied Palestinian territory. It softened references to aid workers killed. This is an organization that had aid workers nearly linked deaths to insecurity, removed mentions of mass graves, starvation, and malnutrition. Just as an update, I checked that website was updated in January. Commingling is now gone, which is a term that the IDF has used. But also all references to Palestine are gone. So in terms of some of the reaction to staff, as you know from your own organizations, I think some of the complaints was that there was silence from leadership. People felt their concerns were not considered. Staff who spoke out said they were said to be emotional or exaggerating. An internal review at IRC that was shared with me warned we are breaking people with this response. As others have said, neutrality is used as a justification for this. To me, it feels like it becomes a blanket defense. It's not that it's defending inaction. I know these are difficult decisions. Ryan from the South to criticize. It feels like it's a blanket defense against not having to explain your actions, and that doesn't seem like a good strategy. I think it's also it extends further than simply Gaza. Humanitarian principles are used as a blanket defense against explaining anything. Organizations right now are removing references to diversity, equity, inclusion, and gender from their websites. In their explanation to me on why the IRC invoked humanitarian principles. I know it shouldn't all come down to the moment we're facing in terms of money and what's happening in the US, but I think there is a worrying trend. I think a lot of humanitarian actors with no access to Gaza are still present or hoping for access because there has not been a mega crisis, quote unquote, in the humanitarian sector since I would say Ukraine. And by mega crisis, I mean somewhat cynically kind of crisis that helps you raise funds for your organization. Gaza could have been that crisis if there had been access. And of course, we know there's not. So if we view neutrality as a tool for that access, sure, it's gone. But if you look at our current funding crisis and the competition that already exists, what trade-offs will organizations make? Already, Israel is seeking to impose new guidelines and registrations, and more than guidelines for NGOs. It's unclear whether they'll be able to take a principled position. Trend of divide and conquer is valid. I think forward, I don't think there will be. It'll be difficult for a collective position because there will be someone who is willing to make those trade-offs. Anyway, so I started this talking about decolonization. So I want to kind of come back to it. It's just it strikes me as how often Gaza comes up in conversations that have nothing to do with Gaza. I was interviewing people last year when Tom Fletcher was appointed as a new emergency relief coordinator. And he seems like a nice guy. People say it's another opaque appointment, definitely not that. So it comes up in these same conversations with Security Council vetoes, the appointment of another group, bad faith climate negotiations at Gaza. These were local humanitarian leaders talking to me about that. I was asking them what they thought about Fletcher. They talked about Gaza. It's alienating. I think people who feel that they're not an equal part of the international aid system, it's a reminder of how distant they are. So I think there are broader implications where we're all here supposed to be encouraged to come together, to be united, to reset, to renew, to regrow. I think Gaza has to be a part of that conversation, one way or the other. If you're a government donor, a so-called emerging government donor, why would you invest in a system double standards clear? If you're someone who uses aid, you see what's happening. the mainstream international humanitarian sector talks about mutual aid. We've been hearing ERRs, soup kitchens in Gaza mentioned, localization again. But local organizations don't stick to humanitarian action. NGOs and CSOs are not just humanitarian. All of the above as I need. So what happens if they express their opinions? So these old solutions are being trotted out as the solution. I think if we're not really willing, the sector is not willing to engage on neutrality and engage on Gaza, then it's not really a good starting point for whatever turns out to be at all.
So, Erin, I'm going to give the floor to Meg online.
Thank
Or
you
is
so
there-
much. Can you hear me?
Yes. Actually, before you start, Meg, I'm just going to ask, I think there's a bit of whisper in the room in the middle, and it messes up with the system online, especially because there's a lot of people online, at least 200 people, and they can't hear well. So I would kindly ask you not to whisper towards the end.
Hear well in the back.
Yeah.
We don't.
Oh, you can't hear?
Well.
Okay, maybe we'll make sure to speak louder in the mic. Yeah. And Meg, the floor is yours now.
Okay, hopefully I can be heard in the back. Shout
Oh,
out.
no.
Can you maybe speak a bit louder?
I
Or
can
maybe
try. Is that better?
No. No.
maybe try again speaking, Meg?
Is that better? Can I be turned up somehow?
Try.
These other ones. On the top of this, on the top of the sound bar? Yeah. Can you try again?
Yes. Testing. Can you hear me?
It's a bit better, no? I'll call AB. Sorry about that. Maybe you can also.
Yeah, Meg, we're going to have you started maybe a bit louder, and we're calling the AV guy in the meanwhile.
Okay, I'll see if I can project.
Sorry.
All right, sorry about that. I hope that people were able to hear Bushra earlier on, but I wanted to start by saying thank you to Aya for pushing this conversation into the agenda, because I know that that's been sort of a passion since the last HNPW. And I was quite nervous to join this panel. I think one reason being that it's 1 o'clock in the morning and I never know what I'm going to say when I'm this tired. But two, I was very worried in the same way that Bushra was, that we would sort of stray into very academic territory. And I'm sure that, like many people in the room, I woke up this morning and checked my phone, and I think in the past days it's been another 270 kids who have been killed by Israel. Maybe it's gone up again since I checked. And I don't know what's more disturbing anymore, whether it's the atrocities or the fact that it does not register anymore in the mainstream media. If 270 kids were killed in a matter of days in Israel or in Australia or in Switzerland, it would be everywhere. Not to mention the fact that that's on top of, I think, 14,000 other children who have already been killed. More journalists have been killed. Settlers tried to lynch an Oscar-winning filmmaker, which also was barely a blip on the news. There are colleagues from the Palestinian Red Crescent who have been missing for days. When an Australian aid worker was impacted, it was front page news everywhere. Now no one even knows. But the reason I want to say that is that I have sort of a different position in this to what Bushra does, obviously. And we all grew up looking at the atrocities of the Holocaust and saying we would never let that happen again. And what's happening now by Israel, it's not actually just by Israel, it's being enabled by so many people and by so many of us. This is a situation that meets the conditions of a genocide that is enabled by, in many cases, the governments who we vote for and the products that we buy and the silence that we keep, whether we're at work or not. And that's the context in which this discussion takes place. And so I'm hoping that this is a discussion that makes us all a bit uncomfortable. And I think if it does, then Aya has done her job. We at Ground Truth Solutions have done some research in Gaza, and I want to talk a little bit not about the research necessarily, but about the process. The first report we did, we started doing it quite soon after October 7, when things really started to escalate on October 14. And it was kind of this compulsion that took over me where I said, we are an organisation who can have a role to play, I guess, in making people's voices heard. At least that's what we try to do. And someone needs to do that here. We didn't have money for it. There was no one within the sector requesting it from us. But because everywhere we looked, there was silence, we thought we had to do something. We were told at that stage that it wouldn't be possible to get data from Gaza, so don't bother. Getting data from Gaza means talking to people. That's all it means. That's all it means for us. And so we didn't accept that. We worked with an organisation called Arab World for Research and Development based in Ramallah. We pooled our resources. We didn't have any money. And we asked people in Gaza what they were thinking about, what they needed, what they were doing, what was getting them through the day, what they wanted from different actors. That was the first of 2 reports. You can find them online. But the things that sort of strike me about that process looking back, one was this real instinct from OURAD and from GTS to support in some way a reminder that people in Palestine were human beings. And I'm sort of ashamed to say that, and it's really disturbing when you think about it, but that was a real goal of the research. And unfortunately, it was kind of, the need for that was confirmed by the research itself. When so many people said to us, when we asked them, what is the primary thing you want the international community to know or to do right now? They said that we want them to see us as human beings. The second thing was the resistance that we got, and we got it sort of quietly. And I think what mattered was that in country, there was a country team working in incredibly dangerous situations who welcomed the work. They said, you know, we will use this in ways that people will not see, but we are not able to say these things, and I'm glad that you are. There were a couple of people in UN agencies, not in Gaza, who didn't want us to publish a report. Then when we did, they said it was boring because everyone already knows that things in Gaza aren't very good, so why bother asking people about it? There was not a single funder who would touch that work. And that was interesting to me because given the unfolding scale of that crisis and the human toll, in any other situation, that would be the moment where there would be some money floating around for a small piece of research like that. Government donors were not interested. DEC did not launch an appeal. And at the time, I remember being really sort of surprised and frustrated by that. And then donors were not even that forthcoming in discussing or sharing the results, which is very strange for us. Finally, a foundation came in, and I'm grateful for that because it meant that we could keep going. But the third thing that was sort of a paradox was that this was the most popular work we had ever done in the eyes of the general public. So the Gaza work that we did, it was used quite widely as an advocacy tool. It was picked up by Al Jazeera. It was shared pretty widely on social media, and it drew this real non-humanitarian crowd to our work. We had young people who were probably more interested in concepts of justice than in humanitarian aid. And I remember at the time thinking, isn't this sort of interesting that aid agencies are really quiet, but citizens are loud? And that sort of created a level of discomfort that I think a lot of us have now become very familiar with. I just want to talk quickly about this question of tensions between humanitarian norms and principles and neutrality and this idea of putting people at the center that we love to talk about so much. And I think anyone who knows me knows that I don't love that term. I think it's a bit of a farce, and there are many reasons why we don't actually want to listen to people affected by crisis. Generally, it's because their views don't mesh with the ways that aid operates, and that makes people uncomfortable. And so if you ask people what they want and it's not what you can provide, you're raising expectations and all the rest of it. But in this case, it's because we're supposed to be neutral, and a population that is oppressed and occupied is not going to be neutral. And so if anyone was sort of serious about putting people at the center of humanitarian action and listening and amplifying views, it's the same story in Myanmar. You have to be prepared for views that are not going to be neutral, and then you have to make a decision about whether you are prepared to amplify those or not. And to be fair, the views that we got, many of them were about humanitarian assistance, and they were very non-controversial. People wanted aid. I mean, this is a population that is being systematically starved as a demonstration of one of many breaches of international law. So people were hungry, they asked for food. Mostly what they asked for was for the international community to stop abandoning them and for Israel to stop murdering their children. And I just want to quickly share a very tiny glimpse into some of the things that they asked us to share. I have the right to live like other people. This is a war of genocide. Is there an international community at all? We live in a cemetery. We thank you for your silence. The international community failed us. Genocide is our destiny. Life in Gaza is humiliation and tragedy. The world is aware of the tragedy and remains unmoved. The whole world is just watching. Death follows us everywhere. Shame on you. This is hell. What more pain do you want than this? And why have you left us in this situation? We have pages of that. So I could keep reading that out for the next hour. That's the people who are at the center. And I guess a question to all of us is, can we hear that and say, let's be neutral? And, you know, whether or not we want to exempt operators is a different story. I'm not going to judge someone who is trying to move aid around in Gaza for being silent if it's going to help them reach someone today. But I'm just not sure that there's such a thing as neutral anymore. This is not a war. It's not a war where there's equality across sides, as other panelists have said. Neutrality means silence, which means standing with an oppressor, not the oppressed, and that's not neutral. And I think a really sort of when we have to hold up a mirror is that we have all these fancy terms and we love them and we love saying that we're working towards them. But we can't have our cake and eat it here. Like, we can't be silent on Gaza, but then attend a webinar about decolonizing aid that's led by someone from SOAS and then go away and think that we're good people. You can't pretend to support decolonized aid on the one hand and then be neutral in the face of a colonizer who is committing genocide on the other. You can't say you care about accountability and then not demand accountability for breaches of international law that are killing people, but say that you're accountable because you set up a hotline for the UN. It just doesn't work that way. And I think there's a lot for us to grapple with and probably look harder in the mirror more than anywhere else. But I think a really great question for us all to ask as human beings, and I'm really grateful that the New Humanitarian actually asked us to do this months ago in a very strongly worded op-ed, is to just think about how history will look back and see us at this moment. And I think it's very difficult for many of us to answer that question with a lot of confidence. So I'll stop there because I know that we're going to have a conversation, but thanks for letting me speak from the middle of the night in Australia.
Thanks a lot, Meg, for joining us in the middle of the night from Australia. I'm gonna before we open for questions, I'm just gonna ask the speakers maybe to give us share one thing they want humanitarian practitioners to take away from the conversations they've had today. I'm gonna start again with Bushra.
I mean, I think I kind of touched upon it, but for me, what I want to be taken away today is not just you listening and agreeing, because I think many of us in this room probably agree on everything that was said, but I think like these conversations need to be taken to leaderships. And these conversations need to be happening at leadership level, because often that's also an issue that we all often face is, you know, us at kind of like the staff level, or you know, maybe senior management level, we're all in agreement, but you know, I think like there's also a key role here for the leadership of the humanitarian sector to really have a deep think about what this looks like, you know, moving forward, and how can we reshape what humanitarian principles mean in the context of Gaza. And I think I'm glad that Erwin, you also mentioned the bad faith kind of like climate negotiations. I mean, that's a great example as well of, you know, this idea of these principles that we just, you know, we say and with our words, but really when it comes to like on the ground reality, they're not at all implemented. So for me, it's also like take these conversations to your leadership and force your leadership to also have those conversations, but also work together. I think like there's so much value in collective action, and we've seen it in Gaza when INGOs have gotten together and have done the joint statements and have applied pressure in a kind of coordinated joint way through the joint media briefings that we've done, and you know, the joint press releases and the joint videos. We know that there has been change, and there has been, we are kind of maybe heard a little more. And it's helped also a lot of organizations push a lot of their own boundaries internally. So continuing to do that and really trying to build the argument of why this does have impact, because I think you know, it's easier to work on your own, right? It's much more difficult to work within a movement and to coordinate, but we really need to see the impact that this has, even though impact when it comes to advocacy and these things, it takes so long to really see the fruits of your labor. But I think we can see some small wins here and there when pressure has been applied. So my key takeaway is please speak to your leaderships and force these conversations amongst yourselves and amongst your respective organizations.
You've heard Bushra request you all. Now I'm gonna Lean, you go next. But we're gonna try to be a bit concise just to kind of give space for the questions.
I think Thank you. I think just we should be looking at principles as an operational tool, and what we need to be measuring is not personal or organizational commitments to these principles, but whether people are receiving assistance in a principled fashion. And we also need to, I think, expand the definition of humanitarianism and the principles to include human rights, justice, and solidarity. So we can, the old principles are outdated, I think, and what discussion has showed us is that they're outdated. So include justice, solidarity, and improving human rights. Yeah.
I'm not really the advice giving type, but I guess if there's a thing for everyone who's stake in this is to do the work that rebuilds trust. I think so often we think of a concept like neutrality and revamping it, reforming it, and you know, that's a massive where do you even start? So I think if you look at the people who you want to trust or who should trust you but don't, why don't they? And start there. And I think often that starts with a conversation, starts with genuine transparency, decision making, and genuine inclusion in the decision making process. So doing the work builds trust.
And Meg, one thing you'd like to share that you want humanitarian practitioners to take away from this conversation?
I mean, I think one thing would be to look at your own positionality, and I think not to self-censor when maybe you don't have to. I think there are certain people who are facing very real repercussions and are scared to say anything. There are a lot of people who are sort of assuming that and staying quiet just because it's more comfortable. And I think that's kind of not an acceptable response at the moment. And if I can squeeze in another one, I just want to echo what Bushra said earlier about the fact that, you know, humanitarianism is not our only framework. And even if it's sort of scary to talk in a way that maybe breaches principles or you fear repercussions, the framework of international law, as ineffective as it can be, has been the whole basis by which Francesca Albanese has been able to garner so much support and have such a big impact. And I think that's something that we just don't look at very often because we think we exist in this exceptional bubble.
Thank you, Meg. Thank you all for the very, very insightful contributions. I have a lot of questions, but I'd like to hear first from the audience. If anyone has any questions, we'll open the floor in the room as well as online. Don't be shy. Yeah, the lady in the red. You don't need mics because I think there's some in the patch in the booth.
Okay, thank you. Oops. And thanks to the panelists. I mean, I have to say, I'm probably one of the oldest people in the room here or in the audience. And I spent much of my life being a humanitarian and or a human rights person, and sometimes both. And what kind of challenged me or obliged me to come here was one of the questions saying that there's this tension between a humanitarian and addressing protection concerns. And that really bothered me because I think, there isn't enough time to go through all of this. And I wondered, is it a question of definition? So I use terms like humanitarian action. So it's not just about aid. Humanitarian action, in my experience, was always about addressing and mitigating the harm that puts lives in danger. And in any war zone that I've worked in, it is the way the war is conducted is a central issue. So one is neutral in the sense of not favoring one warring party over another, but one is totally not neutral between perpetrator and what civilians are made to suffer. So I don't think one should get wrapped up in, so I think the same applies in Gaza. I mean, I'm not working in Gaza, but I've tried to educate myself on it and participate in different discussions on it. And clearly, I think in many ways, what's happening in the Middle East and in Palestine obliges us all to rethink what indeed is the essence of humanitarianism, as well as indeed of, I think humanitarians can only do so much. I don't think it's a solution to deep-rooted problems that need to be addressed in that context. And it doesn't mean about working in a silo of having a humanitarian hat on or a human rights hat on. I'm always working with others to address what are the issues that are putting lives in danger. Thank you.
Thank you. For others, if you have a question that's directed at a particular panelist, please do mention their name. And I'm going to take maybe like 3 questions before handing over to the panelist. The lady in...
Hi, I'm Yasmin. So first, I have to say that the 3 days we've been here, it's been a bit scary how much we talk about the principles as if they are something not to be questioned. I think I was a bit shocked. I did not expect that there are, like, especially neutrality, is something that we cannot discuss. So thank you for the panel today. Second is that we are today also again in a crisis of legitimacy, and neutrality was created because a big international entity had a crisis of legitimacy. So I really hope that this does not repeat itself. But my question is more to all the humanitarian practitioners that claim that we know the priorities of the people. Does any survey on needs include freedom, liberation, smashing the patriarchy? I don't know. Are there options in our surveys? No, we say water, food, of course they're important, but we are not also giving the options that then we say are not a priority for people when they want food, etc. So we are already starting with biased surveys because of our colonial inherent nature. And the same for risk assessments. And I know Bushra knows this because we've had these discussions internally. It's like when we are doing risk assessments for our programs or safe programming, I work in protection, do we actually ask, is this doing harm to the liberation struggle of the people? No, we think, is it doing now physical harm? So again, like, review your risk assessments. Can we do it? Is it possible? Really, my questions are so naive because I feel these 3 days that most of the things I believe should be done don't seem to be options even. Do we ask, like, what type of harm it's doing to the population on the medium and long term respects rather than just the immediate physical harm or the reputational harm? So even like to the panelists, I think Meg touched a bit on this, like, how we can change the way we do assessments. And really, it needs to be transformative because it's not working.
Thank you. I'm going to give the floor to Laith.
Yes, thank you, Aya. Thanks, everyone. Laith Abu Nawas, and I'm actually a third-generation Palestinian refugee. I cannot get to Palestine.
Just if you could speak up a little bit. 'Cause we
Yes,
can't
I
hear.
will try. And thank you for having this session and this discussion. And indeed, I share a lot of what other people asked about, especially when it comes to the crisis in Gaza. And I wonder, I'm not an international law expert, but I don't know if neutrality still exists as a principle if the ICJ in their statement declare Palestinian people in Gaza and in the West Bank as a protected people, and therefore as a protected group. And being silent as an international organization is becoming like you are becoming as a complicit in what is happening to these people. I would like to shed the light on one of the exercises I did as a data engineer, where I collected different publications from international humanitarian organization who used to publish about a crisis, the same as what is happening in Sudan, the same as it happened in Kiev, in Ukraine, and etc. And I just wanted to see how vocal are they about what is happening in Gaza. To my surprise, that's my question, I found some of those organizations in the silent zone, like zero publication about what is happening in Gaza. And for me, that's really something making me confused, because is it like a choice for those organizations to stay in silent, or is it something else? And what should be taken as an action from an international community to address this issue? And I'm going to update this spectrum study to publish more organizations, but finding around 15 NGOs, international NGOs, out of the 60 that I did my data collection, where they are with zero publication, is something raising a big question. And thank you, Aya.
Shall we answer those, or shall we take one more? One more? Okay, one more question. Let's go ahead.
My name is Antonio Donini. Thank you for your presentations. Some of it, all of it was very interesting, but some of it left me with a sense of that we were not framing the question in the right way. Given the hurricane that's happened with the cuts of USAID funding and the surprise with which most of the humanitarian system, discovered that it was totally dependent on Western donors. I think this debate on neutrality is sort of overtaken by the events. So are we prepared? I mean, because there's a sense that if the donors allowed us, if our leaders helped us, we would be able to be more respectful of the principle of neutrality. I think that we have to take the discussion in a completely different direction, which is if we are so dependent on Western donors, then why are we surprised? We are seen or used as the how do you say, the capillary vessels of globalization. We are part of soft power. We now discover that. We didn't know that until Trump told us. So there's a problem of talking to the issues in a way that's more. Of course, I agree with everybody who said that we shouldn't find ourselves in a situation where we self-censor, where we do things, we cover up what we do in order to maintain access. But there's why is that happening? Because we are totally dependent on empire.
For that question, I think we'll answer this question before taking another round. I just wanted to add, just on the point that Laith mentioned, one thing that I've noticed as well is that within the NGO space, we've seen like a lot more conservatism than the UN, which is something that I thought was really interesting, because usually the NGOs are the ones kind of like pushing the UN to be a little bit more accountable. At least that's the narrative. Wasn't quite widespread. But I think when it came to Gaza, we saw that the UN were putting statements that were much more like bold and forefront compared to what the NGOs have been kind of able to muster. maybe we can start again with Bushra, and then feel free to answer whatever questions you'd like, and we'll do all the speakers.
Okay, so there was some comments and questions, so I have some reflections to the comments and potentially maybe some sort of answers, because some of them are quite existential, and I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer them. But you know, I want to start by saying that all of you are absolutely right. We're really in a crisis of legitimacy, and not just in Gaza, but for the humanitarian system itself. Many of us are experiencing, and I think Meg kind of talked about it as well, a kind of like reckoning. And we've long held onto those principles of neutrality and impartiality and independence as if they were sacred. But Gaza has really forced us to ask, like, are we really applying those principles consistently? And when we stay silent in the face of atrocity, whose interests are we serving? Like you said, one of the audience, the ICJ has confirmed that Palestinians are a protected group because there's a plausible risk of genocide. And so in that context, silence is not neutral. Like I said in my opening speech, it's complicity. And yet we see organizations that were, for example, like you said, bold in Ukraine and Myanmar and Syria, but suddenly they're falling silent when it comes to Gaza. And that's not because, of course, Gaza is more complex, because actually speaking out on Palestine comes with consequences, and many institutions are simply not built to withstand those consequences. And that brings me to the deeper issue one of you raised, is about aid dependence. And the truth is, Gaza, of course, has exposed something that many of us already knew or felt, but perhaps maybe we couldn't articulate until now, that our sector is structurally dependent on Western governments, many of whom are directly or indirectly complicit in what's happening. Whether it's through arms transfers, political cover, or economic pressure, the very donors we're relying on are often, you know, the ones that are enabling the conditions we're trying to mitigate. So if we're surprised that aid is being cut or that UNRWA is under attack, maybe that's because we're only realizing the full extent of that dependence. And so we're not neutral actors floating above geopolitics. We're part of a global system, and at times we become, like you said, somebody said, vessels of soft power. Absolutely, even unintentionally. And it doesn't mean that our work isn't important. It means that we need to be much more honest about the contradictions we're navigating, and this session, I'm hoping, you know, can be a kind of a start for that. And when we talk about neutrality today, it often looks like the statements, you know, that name both sides, while Israeli bombs are like literally falling on refugee camps and burning people alive. And humanitarians, for example, are told not to mourn their families online, or, you know, very, very openly, or organizations are not mourning the family of staff, for example, openly either. And local staff, for example, like we many of us said on the panel, are expected to be silenced while their community is completely is being destroyed before their eyes. And I think, Yasmin, you should said it, risk assessments that measure harm to institutions, they're not measuring people's dignities or hopes for freedom. And you asked whether we could include liberation in our risk assessments. I mean, I think, yeah, we must, because if our programs or our frameworks or our language are unintentionally undermining people's rights or erasing their struggle, then what exactly are we protecting? Humanitarianism is not just about reducing harm, it should be about refusing to normalize it as well. So yes, Gaza is forcing us to rethink humanitarianism, and not to abandon it, but to reclaim it, to return to the roots of humanitarianism, the protection of life, of dignity, of justice. And that means shifting not just our language, but also our funding methods, our alliances, and our internal cultures. And like many of us said, we can't keep self-censoring just to maintain access. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't work. And we've seen it in Gaza. It doesn't work, because even those that have remained silent, they also don't have access. We've been, you know, Israel has blocked aid for the last 4 weeks now, 1 month, and not one truck has entered Gaza. And so where are those silent organizations now? And so because access without accountability, it's, you know, it's not humanitarianism, that's logistics and operations. And we're not logisticians, we're humanitarians. And that means we have a duty not just to deliver aid, but also to tell the truth.
Thank you, Bushra. Lean, would you like to go next?
Yes, just like a couple of thoughts on what you said, Yasmin. I think it's a great question, that why are we not including in our needs assessment these things about
Microphone, use your microphone.
Sorry. I was saying that it's a great question that why are we not including in our needs assessment questions about freedom, liberation, smashing the patriarchy, but even strip it down further, we're not even asking questions about needs that are beyond life-saving assistance. So humanitarians stress that we are all about life-saving assistance, but humanitarians are usually the ones that stay in protracted crises, and there are more protracted crises than ever now. So they're the ones that are there. So we're not asking about education, for example, in needs assessments. We're asking about shelter, food, water, but people themselves are asking about longer-term interventions. So I think we need to re-ask, we need to re-look at these needs assessments as humanitarians. I think I'll stop there to give more time.
Thanks. Yeah, just to comment on the last question from the gentleman there. I agree with you. I think it's part of the same conversation where if you have, you know, Gaza exposed, among any other crises, the humanitarian trouble with neutrality as a principle as defined by a few actors. The current funding crisis exposes independence as a principle and the way the system is funded. So I think any revamping, rethinking of how the system works has to address that. But the problem is, how do you achieve scale other than through government institutions, government donors? So I think, I'd like to hear people who are smarter than me talk about that.
Erwin and Meg, if you'd like to go at any of the questions.
Yeah, and I'll be brief because I'm sure that people in the room have better answers than me on these things. But I think the question about needs assessments was actually generous. I think the assessments are worse than the way that they were outlined. They don't even often ask needs questions by sector, as in they don't ask, what do you need when it comes to food? They ask very specific technical questions that someone then takes away and analyzes far from those people and then determines what the needs are and then determines even further from those people what the response should be. I think not to sort of dwell on doom and gloom, I think one thing that we're all seeing now in line with this US funding crisis is that the data landscape for humanitarianism has been kind of obliterated, which means there is an opportunity to actually build some of these systems in a different way. And I think if we don't address this issue of extractive needs assessments now, at this moment, we're really missing a trick. And I really like the idea of including some of these broader themes in them. Similarly, I think, although I agree with Erwin on this question of scale, because that's always the criticism that I get when I try and raise different examples of ways of doing things, we do talk about this sector like it's a monolith, and it definitely isn't. And there are examples, I think, of organisations who can deliver assistance and be very outspoken and be able to go to bed at night and say that we're contributing to justice and humanitarianism. Some of those are agencies to some extent, like Oxfam, like Choose Love, I would say in the UK is quite good at that. But many of them are more of these kind of diaspora-led organisations who couldn't possibly support humanitarianism without supporting also these bigger themes of justice. And I think the scale question, there is a massive issue with distribution of wealth, that if there was sort of better systems of taxation or another injection of cash like the one that came from Mackenzie Scott a couple of years ago, that could actually make sort of a scalable difference. So I'm not trying to be Pollyanna about a situation that I think is incredibly difficult, but I do feel like there are some moments at the moment for kind of rebuilding things in different ways out of necessity.
Thanks a lot, Meg. I'm gonna maybe take another round of questions, and I'm gonna read a few questions online. I'm going to start with online questions. So the first question is, the world has been more mobilized on this issue than probably any else, and yet leaders effectively just ignore us. We can force conversation with our leaders, but they can't force the ones who count. So where does that leave us? That's the first question. And the second question is kind of similar to the one regarding dependency of aid on nation states. Isn't the real bottleneck that we are too dependent on nation states, either because they're member states from multilateral agencies or donors, How can we create editorial independence? To use a journalistic term, from those nation states, independence of operations and decision making. This is the wishful thought of all humanitarians. I'm going to take maybe 2 more questions from the floor. Anyone? Yes.
Microphone, or maybe I speak louder. I'm Francois from Group UAD. I'm sorry, I missed part of the beginning because I just arrived from Ukraine now. I was in Kiev yesterday, and the same question were raised about assessment. Do we need to do assessment when we know that cities have been totally destroyed, when the water system is destroyed, where the heating system is destroyed? Most of the time, we don't need to have assessment. We need to bring things, and people will choose what they need. So I think we are stuck in this evidence-based versus experience-based debate. A destroyed city in Gaza, I've been many times in Gaza in the past. We know what it means during the previous war, what it means when Gaza was destroyed. We know the needs. We don't need to do more need assessment. So I think we're stuck in a bit of a joke. And that we believe that by doing our survey, and as it was just said, we take time and it will be tweeted and we have to see if it's representative. This is a joke when we have a city totally destroyed. It could be Gaza, it was Mariupol 2 years ago, it is Bakhmut now. And so I think we have to have a strong discussion with the donors saying, don't push us to do another set of assessment. We know, because we have been through those things, we have been exploring those city destroyed, and we know what is needed. And in fact, when we talk with people, I've been discussing with many people, say, we're tired to see this NGO coming with an assessment. We're tired. We don't want to be assessed anymore. Because after Bakhmut, after Izium, and in Gaza the same, the needs are known. I think we have to get a bit out of that. So my question is, how do we convince the donors that at a stage, experience of many crises of the same kind is enough and we don't need any more evidence-based with assessment?
Thank you. We can take one last question if anyone has any last burning question. Right?
Like the previous speaker, I wasn't able to be here for the whole meeting. But this week, I'm hearing the word principles shifted to the word values. How concerned should I be?
Bushra, start with you again.
Thank you. I mean, I really feel the exhaustion behind what everybody just said, and I share it. You have no idea, so deeply. Especially this last week has been notoriously exhausting. And the world absolutely has never been so more mobilized around Palestine and Gaza. And like I said, you know, millions of people have marched, they've spoken out, they've risked their jobs, they've risked their safety, and yet our leaders remain completely unmoved, silent, complicit, and we as humanitarian actors are just left navigating the rubble, literally, quite literally in Gaza, but also morally. And we're asked to keep going and to keep responding and to stay neutral and to maintain access. But access to what? Like you said, it's a destroyed city, a population being starved, a place where humanitarian workers are killed every day while waiting for convoys that never come. You know, at some point, like you said, we have to say, you know, there's big parts of the system that are broken, and not because of one bad actor, but because, like you said, and like we've been discussing, I think it was because it's been built on dependence and on funding streams that are completely tied to geopolitical interests, and on frameworks that are prioritizing institutional risk over community survival. And you know, I mean, in my opinion, and this is my humble opinion, Gaza's really ripped the mask off. And then comes, you know, the punchline, like, can you do an assessment? And like you said, how do you assess needs in a place where everything's been destroyed and where famine is no longer looming, and, you know, is no longer even looming? It's basically there. And where hospitals are no longer functioning, and where people are living under tents on sand and drinking salt water, burying their children. And it's not a data gap, it's a moral one. And we're stuck in a farce. You know, and evidence-based humanitarianism in a context where the evidence is being bombed before our eyes, basically. You know, sorry. I mean, I guess I'm kind of ranting with all of you. Yeah, but I want to say this clearly, you know, like you said, we don't need, I agree, we don't need another assessment. What we really need is action, and what we need is unrestricted access. And we need political will, and we need accountability. You know, I speak to my friends and my colleagues and my family in Gaza every day. People we work with, and people who are displaced, and they're starving and they're grieving. And you know, every single one of them say, and especially our partners, just stop asking us what we need. Just listen to us. So yes, we need to have a strong, honest conversations with donors, and we need to stop pretending that this is about logistics. The needs, like you said, are known. I mean, there's no other way to say it. And the blockade is political and deliberate, and the aid delays are a policy of Israel. And if donors are asking us to keep assessing instead of acting, then it's also our role to push back. Because we can't continue to be also complicit or risk to be complicit in the cycle. And from my sense, it's also about building a different system that means exactly this, that refuses to play along with the rituals of a broken one, and refusing to reduce, liberation or self-determination to metrics, and refusing to flatten crimes of atrocity into spreadsheets. We really owe people in Gaza and ourselves more than that.
Thank you, Bushra. I'm going to direct maybe specific questions now, just in the interest of time. Maybe, Erwan, is there anything you'd like to say regarding the question on the possibility of creating some kind of editorial independence from nation states, independence of operations and decision making?
I'll take that journalism themed one. Thank you. I think it's the key question. If you're not going to replace the sheer volume of government institutions for donor funding, how do you create that firewall? I think, there are ideas behind pooled funds, don't shoot me, but a larger pooled fund that's not in the hands of the UN. Solidarity taxes, I know that's not going to be popular right now. People smarter than me have a lot to say about this. I think where I'll weigh in is on, again, building the credibility. You're not going to build an alternative system that other donors or the same donors will fund if it remains a slightly smaller version of itself. And that means proving your value, building trust. And proving your value also means, have you looked at alternatives and considered, does that alternative mean not you? Foundations are not funding international organizations. They're not going to. Other government donors, they'll probably still be forced to, but they're looking for ways to use that money well. And right now, they don't think that international organizations are using that money well. So I think it's a matter of how do you build that credibility and how do you build that trust, whatever that means for you and whatever roles you serve right now.
Meg, I'm going to direct a question that came directly to you, and maybe you can kind of like end on that. Meg, can you be a bit more specific about how to rebuild, how to use this opportunity, as I agree with you that there is one? Sorry, it's a question that came online. I wasn't very specific. It's about, among others, finding ways of relaying the voices of people affected more directly into the global and country level decision-making levels and on a more systematic basis.
Yeah, thanks for the question, but I mean, I'm not going to pretend to have all the answers on how to rebuild. I think some glimpses that we have from our work, I think, Ground Truth has spent now 14 years or so listening to people impacted by crisis, and it's a frustrating role to be in because you get the same feedback all the time. And we just published yesterday another report that was a response to this humanitarian reset question. And the themes of that report, which really sort of synthesize across many, many countries what people are calling for the most, don't gel with a reset that would focus on life-saving assistance only according to someone's determination somewhere. And they're questions around how do you accept the fact that in every crisis, every human being is going to want to rebuild? They're not going to want to just withstand a crisis, and that actually investing in that is going to save money in the long run. That's kind of not something that is currently in the dialogue around ruthless prioritization and this cowboy approach to life-saving assistance. And so how to rebuild that, I don't know, but I think what we can do is look at glimpses of where that is possible. And there were a couple of examples that came up before of sort of more of a solidarity approach. I think there are a lot of these diaspora-led approaches that demonstrate when you actually respond to people's priorities, not just their needs, and if that whole system is based on solidarity and not some very outdated form of charity, magic things can happen. Where I can't really help at the moment is, and I said this before and Erwin said it before, there's not really evidence of that scaling. And so it's really difficult to say, look, this worked at a huge scale in this country. I think people need to take way more risks. I think there's less money. We know that the big clunky system doesn't work. So I think people need to say, we're going to change our risk frameworks and we're just going to throw money at things that are closest to communities and trust that they will prioritise in the best way for themselves how they use that funding, and then learn from that process. And this is where it's a shame that media has also been attacked and learning and research has also been attacked, because it's going to be very hard to do that. So I'm afraid that I don't have all the solutions there, but I think there are some sort of glimpses that we can take, but we just have to be prepared to know that we have to kind of do things differently.
Thanks a lot, Meg. Actually, on that note, I think we have to wrap up. I want to thank you all for being here. And I want to thank our amazing panelists for being here and for also contributing a lot to the debate, for all your insightful observations. We really wanted to have the space today to push the boundaries a little bit on Gaza and on the wider humanitarian system, to rethink some of the ethical dilemmas related to neutrality. And I really love how Bushra mentioned like multiple times that humanitarians are not logisticians, and I think I'd really like you to kind of like keep that in mind as we think about like solidarity and what it means to be humanitarian workers in this age and under all this pressure that we are facing at the moment, and to rethink and reclaim humanitarianism, as Bushra puts it. So thank you all for being here, for the lively debates, for the questions. And I'm just going to have one final request before you go. There's a feedback form, if you can fill it. I think it's also in the chat link. It would really be very helpful for us to know how these events are being received, and would really appreciate your feedback. So thanks a lot. And thanks a lot for the whole HQG team, the comms team, who are doing a lot of work behind the scenes, and for Nick for helping us a lot throughout this process. So thank you all. And yeah, have a good rest of the day.